After King Philip's death in 336 BCE, Alexander, at the young age of 20, found himself thrust into a position of immense responsibility. Although just a 20-year-old, Alexander was brilliant, restless, and tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, and already an experienced military commander. Alexander inherited his father's grand plan to invade Persia, but first he had to secure his own position as king. He faced the formidable task of keeping the kingdom united and securing his own power in the face of not only external threats but also internal opposition. Despite his youth and relative inexperience, Alexander demonstrated strategic prowess and a keen understanding of politics. He swiftly moved to consolidate his position, ensuring the loyalty of the Macedonian nobles and executing potential rivals to his throne. As such, he successfully navigated the treacherous waters of succession politics and emerged as the undisputed king of Macedon. However, Alexander's challenges were far from over. He inherited a kingdom that was rife with discontent and facing external pressures from neighboring states. Some Greek city-states, as well as Macedonian satraps, saw this moment as an opportunity to challenge his authority and assert their independence. Amongst his early challenges, the most significant was Thebes, a powerful city-state that had been an ally to Macedon in the past. Thebes, under the leadership of its charismatic orator Demosthenes, decided to revolt against Macedonian rule. Alexander, determined not to let this rebellion go unchallenged, swiftly marched his forces towards Thebes. In a display of his military acumen, Alexander managed to capture Thebes in a matter of weeks. The city was brutally sacked, setting an example for any other city that may have contemplated rebellion. This brutal display of force effectively crushed any resistance and sent a clear message to his rivals. Alexander was a force to be reckoned with, and his rule would not be easily denied. With the immediate threat subdued, Alexander turned his attention to solidifying his rule within Greece. He skillfully coordinated diplomatic efforts, combining political maneuvers with military campaigns to establish his authority over various Greek city-states. Through a combination of military might and persuasive diplomacy, Alexander managed to bring most of Greece under his control. However, Alexander's ambitions did not stop at Greece. He was determined to expand his dominion and fulfill the dream of his father, the conquest of Persia. This ambitious military campaign would test his leadership and military genius, but it would also pave the way for the creation of one of the greatest empires in history. In the spring of 334 BC, now ready to launch his war against the Persian Empire, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was the start of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. In the spring of 334 BC, now ready to launch his war against the Persian Empire, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was the start of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Alexander's army was about 40,000 strong, drawn from all parts of Greece. The infantry were commanded by the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion. In the front rank, 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, armed with the 18-foot sarissa. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and drilled, who formed up for battle in the phalanx, 16 ranks deep. This packed formation presented a solid wall of iron spear tips and was virtually unstoppable. But it was also difficult to maneuver, and highly vulnerable to attacks on its flanks, or rear. So 3,000 elite infantry, the hypaspists or shield-bearers, armed with shorter spears, guarded its flanks. They were commanded by Parmenion's son, Nicanor. The second line of Alexander's army was made up of 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries, armed as hoplites. They took their name from the hoplon, their large round shield, and carried shorter 8-foot spears. A hoplite phalanx was not as effective as the Macedonian phalangites, but still well-armed and heavily armored for the time. The Agrianes were the army's elite skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what's now southern Bulgaria. Other skirmishers from Thrace and Illyria were armed with javelins, slings, and bows. The shock troops of Alexander's army were the companion cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen armed with spear and sword, commanded by Philotas, another son of Parmenion. Alexander led the royal squadron in person. There were also 1,800 cavalry from Thessaly, commanded by Callus, 600 from other parts of Greece, led by Arigius, and 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, under Cassander. On the other hand, the great Persian Empire was divided into provinces, called satrapies. Each satrapy was ruled by a governor or satrap. Those in Asia Minor, now threatened by Alexander's invasion, met to discuss strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, urged them to avoid battle with Alexander. Instead, he advised them to use a scorched earth strategy, to burn villages and crops and withdraw to the interior. Alexander's army, he promised, would quickly starve. It was good advice, but the satraps were unwilling to lay waste to their own provinces without a fight, so they decided to face Alexander's army at the river Granicus. The Persian army formed up behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, about 10,000 horsemen from across the empire. Medes and Hyrcanians from modern Iran, Bactrians from Afghanistan, and Paphlagonians from Turkey's Black Sea coast. Behind in reserve were the infantry, several thousand Greek mercenaries, a common sight in Persian armies at this time. These men fought for Persian gold and were armed with the round shield and short spear of hoplites. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against fellow Greeks and so placed them at the rear. Alexander, determined to attack and destroy this Persian force before it could retreat, raced to the Granicus with his best troops. On his left wing he posted Thessalian, Greek, and Thracian cavalry under Parmenian's command. In the center were the massed spears of the phalanx, its 6 divisions commanded by Perdiccas, Koinos, Amintas, Philip, Meleager, and Crateros. On the right, Alexander himself, with the companion cavalry under Philotas as well, as the elite Hypaspists, the Agrianes, javelin throwers, and the archers. Alexander, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in all, was probably slightly outnumbered, but ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross the river, he ordered an immediate assault. He sent a squadron of companion cavalry to ford the river, followed by a regiment of Hypaspists and the Paeonian light cavalry. Alexander, calling on his men to show their courage, then led his right wing across the river. As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins, darts, and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting. He attacked where the whole mass of their cavalry and leaders were stationed. Around him, a desperate conflict raged. Horses were jammed against horses and men against men. The Macedonians striving to drive the Persians away from the riverbank, the Persians determined to prevent them crossing and to push them back into the river. Alexander's attack seemed reckless, but he was buying time for the rest of his army to cross the river, including the irresistible Macedonian phalanx. Then suddenly Alexander was fighting for his life, charged by 2 Persian nobles. Rosicus rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his sword, breaking off a piece of his helmet. But the helmet broke the force of the blow, and Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then from behind, Spithridates raised his sword against the king, but Black Clitus, son of Dropidas, anticipated his blow, struck his arm, and cut it off, sword and all. Now the Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the battle. Alexander, enraged, or possibly regarding these Greeks as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy. The mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred. Alexander had won a great victory. Asia Minor now lay at his mercy. But the Persian Empire was still a land of immense wealth and power. Already it was mobilizing its vast resources to face him. If Alexander was to conquer this empire and take his place in history, he'd next have to face Darius himself.